Hello, dear aquarists. You selected this video because it's a study about parasites in wild fish compared to the parasites found in pond-raised fish in Nigeria. It's an interesting study because it teaches us a lesson about worm infections to be found in our fish and what could be the reasons, particularly comparing to the wild to the pond fish and what we can learn from it. Some studies are, well, I would say interesting to share, and this is one of them, which is done in Nigeria, a comparative analysis of gastrointestinal parasites in fish from the Kaduna River and selected domestic ponds in the Kaduna metropolis. So in Nigeria, they have fish in the wild, they have fish in the ponds, and it was the goal to study, well, the aim, here it is, of the research, is to analyze the gastrointestinal parasites, so the parasites from the gut, from the intestine, from the river, and the ponds in the metropolis of Kaduna. And the results showed that 197 fish out of the 350 fish that were examined, they were infected, giving an overall prevalence of 56% in the river and in the ponds. So it's nearly 60% of the fish were infected with gastrointestinal parasites. And here the study was done on worms specifically. The infection was significantly higher in fishes from the river, about 68%, than those from the domestic ponds. That was only 27%. So you can imagine, of course, you understand, wild habitats, rivers, is a more risk to having those kind of worm infections. And they found that the highest number of parasites, about 168, were found in three taxonomic groups: the nematodes Capillaria and Camallanus and Contrasecum, and Camallanus also, so 4 species of nematodes were found, and cestodes, Diphlobotrium, and the trematode Clinostomum species was found. The Clinostomum species we know as yellow grub. No, it's an American or an English name. It's a big parasite which looks like white, yellow dots outside on the fish. Unfortunately, this study doesn't show any pictures of the worms or how those fish look like infected with those parasites. It also says that there was no significant difference of intensity and difference in parasitic load to the fish species identified from the river and the ponds. That means there was a same intensity of infection. Still, there was a difference how many fish were infected with worms between the river and the pond. And the study has revealed that the different parasites, the worms in the fish from the river, is a major threat, of course, for fish productivity than those from the selected ponds. Well, we know, like this study tells you, when you collect fish from the wild, you should be aware that you can have a risk of worm infection. And then if you plan a quarantine, like I explained in my Patreon training, that you have to give an appropriate treatment to control those wild worms in those wild fish. So that's something here. The fishermen should take proper actions. Well, to be honest, you as a dealer in ornamental fish, particularly when you're importing, you have to be aware when you have wild fish, you have to take more attention on treating the fish against worm infections, and you will have less incidence on this kind of gastrointestinal worms in pond fish. But in my experience, I've seen much more gill flukes or skin flukes in pond fish or tank raised fish. That's another kind of worm which is not discussed here. Just some critics I have on infections and on handling, but this paper goes particularly on the worms found in the stomach and the intestine. So there is an introduction why it's important that food and protein from fish is important in the world and that we should do more studies. Also the samples, a total of 350 fish were collected, 250 fish from the river and about 100 catfish from a pond. My critics on this study, they only selected catfish from the ponds. Okay, anyway, from the river they had different varieties. But anyway, still interesting to study the worm infection. And then the examination process there was a dissection made on the fish and they selected the gastrointestinal tract, isolated, and then they selected or get the worms out of the tract to be examined and to be diagnosed. The results showed that in total number of fish screened from the river, it means about 170 out of the 250 fish sampled from the river were infested with gastrointestinal parasites, with worms. The parasites were, yes, I said before, Camallanus, Clinostomum, Contrasecum, Capillaria, and Diphyllobotrium. By the 100 fish selected from the ponds, the overall prevalence of the worms in the Clarias, the catfish which were examined here, was 27%. And the parasites they found was Camallanus, and Diphyllobotrium. So a significant higher prevalence of parasites recorded in the river than those from the pond. And also there is some difference. There was no Capillaria found, for example, in the catfish from the ponds. And that might have been due to the feeding habits. Well, we will go to the end about explaining what the difference is in wild and pond-raised fish. Well, we know it's biosecurity. And here then we have tables of the different parasites, the different fish compared to the fish from the pond. You can see the variety of fish from the river, also catfish, but also labeo, Oreochromis, cichlids, tilapia, barbus, labeos, and then the number of fish and the number of fish infected, and you see the higher prevalence, the barbs particularly had 75% had worm infections in the barbs. That's pretty high, maybe feeding habit. Well, some other comparison, that there was more fish infected in the ponds, in the river than in the ponds. And that smaller fish with a smaller weight had a higher number of parasitic infection. Well, there were more smaller fish identified, but still there was a high infection rate, a larger fish. But anyway, let's go in detail the difference between wild fish and pond fish. So 6 species of parasites were identified. You can see it here in percentage, and the highest percentage was Clinostomum, the yellow grub also called. That's a digenetic trematode. And then also Camallanus, and then later on Capillaria. 3 species also were found in domestic ponds, with the Camallanus species particularly most important. And the nematodes were the highest diversity as parasites found in the ponds and in the river. So most of them were nematodes. So if you think about wild fish importing, nematodes is highest prevalence maybe, and also easier to treat because we have many good medications available, which are listed in my books on fish diseases, what you can use to control nematode infections. Here the prevalence and intensity of the worm infections from the river and the ponds. So they said here how high percentage there was available and number of fish infected from the river and here from the pond. So you could learn some lessons here, how important, well, certain fishes were here, like Diplostomum here, 33%. Well, the overall infection was in the tract was very high in the fish, particularly in the river, less in the ponds. Again, it's repeated here. And then here the different species were collected and discussed here. You can go through it. You can see here that the blue part, the river, has the highest amount of parasites in comparison to the two different ponds. The discussion tells, well, evaluating at the same time some studies or references that has been discussed here, that the high infection rate in these fishes could be attributed to factors such as feeding habit, of course, what kind of food do they get, the physical factors, the hygienic hygiene of the water body. That means, are the fish living in an area which is very polluted, for instance, is a risky. And also intermediate host, particularly with Clinostomum or yellow grub or even nematodes, are there intermediate host. And that is, of course, giving a bigger risk in the wild fish. The domestic ponds, of course, had a smaller amount of parasites, and that could be attributed to the sanitary conditions of the pond. We call that biosecurity, and the proper handling of the fish by the owners. So it's more biosecure, it's less wild. The male fish had the highest risk or the highest amount of parasites in comparison to the female, and that's mostly probably due to the different feeding habits and more moving around of the males, and maybe also eating more food. That is a study done, which is interesting to understand. It's not very high, it's about 10-20% higher than the females, but it's still something interesting to learn here. The high nematode parasite in the fish from the river and the ponds indicate that the fish feed on algae and other debris in the water. Particularly between the algae seems to be a risk of getting easier nematode infections. And about 37% of the total parasites from the fish in the pond and about 42% of the river in the wild, and the low prevalence recorded from the ponds may imply that there has been an improvement in management practices in domestic fish, such as reduction in overcrowding. That is the biggest risk that is being taken into account when you deal with pond-raised or tank-raised fish. Overcrowding is the highest risk, in my opinion, in my previous studies I've done in the field of fish diseases, that overcrowding gives the biggest risk, particularly also on worm infections. Also skin flukes and gill flukes, particularly. Think about that. Overcrowding is a big issue. So the conclusion is that most of the parasites were detected from the river and compared to the ponds. Well, we know it. That's the wild. The wild gives it. And the intensity of the parasite load observed during the study showed from the river and the selected pond a high prevalence of worms. Yes, understand that this is a case that can be interesting to study, how it can get into the fish. So it should be taken proper actions by the fishermen, but even for the ponds, wondering how all those worms get into the pond fish also. The bad food infested with larvae, or the birds flying around, no nets, no super biosecurity. To be honest, the ponds would be nearly zero or very small. That means there is some serious biosecure problem in the ponds when I see still such a high percentage of worm infections. Of course, the wild we can't control. You have to take in mind, or you deal with wild fish, you deal with these kind of worm infections. But the pond fish, well, I would tell those authors, take good biosecure measures, prevent that there is worm larvae coming into it, or at least no birds putting in their droppings with the eggs or of larvae of the worms, introducing to the pond, maybe with snails as a second intermediate host. So, well, many things you can learn from it. So, I hope this study explained you a little bit the difference between wild fish and pond fish made in Nigeria. Something to think about, particularly when you're importing fish, dealing with wild fish. I have good quarantine practices explained in my courses and my Patreon. Also, my books explain what actions you can take to take proper handling or treatment against worm infections. So I hope this teach you a lesson, and I hope you subscribe. Go to more of my studies to see what you can learn or look at my videos. So thank you for watching.